The stranger fixed her broken fence. Then her grandmother invited him to dinner. Early autumn had finally reached the quiet suburbs of Quebec. The maple trees lining the neighborhood had just begun trading green for shades of amber and crimson. A cool breeze carried the smell of damp earth after the previous night's storm, and everything seemed peaceful enough to promise an ordinary Saturday morning, until Rosaleen Morgan walked into her backyard. She stepped through the sliding glass door with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, still half asleep. Then she froze. A complete stranger was dismantling her fence, not looking at it, not inspecting it, actually pulling wooden boards off one by one. Rosaleen stood perfectly still for 3 full seconds, wondering whether she was still dreaming. Finally, she cleared her throat. "You know that's my fence, right?" The man stopped mid-swing. He turned around slowly. Work gloves, an old brown jacket with sawdust clinging to one sleeve, a hammer resting comfortably in his hand. He looked more surprised than guilty. "I was hoping you'd notice before I finished." Rosaleen blinked. Usually burglars take televisions. He glanced at the rotten cedar plank lying beside his boots. "Your television probably isn't trying to kill pedestrians." She frowned. "What?" He pointed toward the fence. The previous night's wind had pushed nearly 6 feet of it toward the narrow pathway separating their 2 properties. The posts had split underground. One more strong gust, and the entire section would collapse across the shared walkway. "I saw it leaning this morning," he explained. "I figured it was safer to take it down before gravity made the decision." Rosaleen looked more closely. Now that her heartbeat had slowed, she had to admit he was right. The wood had completely rotted near the base. She probably wouldn't have noticed until someone got hurt. Still, she crossed her arms. "You could have knocked." "I could have." He nodded. "I should have." That answer caught her slightly off guard. No excuses, no argument, just agreement. "So why didn't you?" He looked almost embarrassed. "I thought fixing it first would sound smarter than waking you up before 8. Rosaleen sighed. "It doesn't." "I know." For the first time, she noticed the moving truck parked beside the neighboring house. "So, you're the new neighbor." He smiled politely. "Nicholas Hamilton, Rosaleen Morgan." She glanced toward the damaged fence. "I still haven't decided whether to thank you or report you. I'd prefer the first option. I'm keeping my options open." A tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. She noticed. Pretended she hadn't. Within minutes, Nicholas had already measured new cedar boards and begun replacing the damaged section. Rosaleen watched him work for a while. He moved with quiet confidence. Everything seemed practiced, steady, almost effortless, which became increasingly annoying, because she had absolutely intended to repair the fence herself. Eventually, probably. She put down her coffee. "I'll help." Nicholas looked up. "You don't have to. I know. But it's my fence." He handed her a hammer. "Fair enough." For exactly 3 minutes, things went reasonably well. Then Rosaleen drove a nail so crooked it somehow managed to bend sideways before reaching the wood. Both of them stared at it. Nicholas cleared his throat. "Have you done this before?" She answered immediately. "Obviously." He looked at the nail again. "Was it also crooked before?" She tried very hard not to laugh. "I think you're judging my artistic process." "I apologize. I wasn't aware the fence was expressionist." She laughed despite herself. "Okay, that one was funny. I've been saving it." "You prepared jokes?" "I've had 3 minutes." "You work fast." "I had excellent material." She shook her head. "I've already decided I don't like you." "I'll try harder." "I don't think you should." "Neither do I." For reasons neither of them understood. The conversation never felt awkward. It felt unexpectedly easy. The back door suddenly swung open. An elderly woman stepped carefully onto the porch. Silver hair, soft blue cardigan, the posture of someone whose health had recently demanded a little more patience from life. This was Eleanor Morgan, Rosaleen's grandmother. She had moved in several months earlier after a frightening health scare. Eleanor took exactly 5 seconds to study the scene. First, the half-finished fence, then Nicholas, then Rosaleen holding a hammer she clearly didn't know how to use. Finally, she looked directly at Nicholas. "Are you married?" Rosaleen nearly dropped the hammer. "Grandma," Nicholas blinked. "No, Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Do you eat? Rosaleen covered her face. Please stop interviewing the neighbor. Eleanor ignored her completely. Dinner, 7 o'clock. Nicholas looked helplessly toward Rosaleen. She raised both hands. Don't look at me. Apparently I don't have any authority here. Eleanor smiled warmly. So? Nicholas hesitated. Only briefly. I'd be happy to. There, Eleanor said proudly. That wasn't difficult. Then she turned around and walked back inside, as though inviting complete strangers to dinner happened every Saturday. Rosaleen stared after her. I'm so sorry. Nicholas smiled. I've been invited to stranger situations. I somehow doubt that. So do I. At exactly 7 o'clock, Nicholas stood outside the Morgan house carrying a loaf of fresh bread from the neighborhood bakery. Rosaleen opened the door. You actually came. I've learned that saying no to your grandmother may not be an option. She laughed. You're catching on. Inside, dinner was already waiting. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, apple pie cooling by the window. The house felt warm, comfortably lived in. Nothing fancy. Everything is genuine. Dinner quickly became a conversation almost entirely controlled by Eleanor. So, she asked while serving potatoes, what do you do? I'm an architect. Good. Useful. Rosaleen interrupted. Grandma. What? I'm collecting information. You make it sound like he's applying for citizenship. I'm simply asking responsible questions. She turned back toward Nicholas. Can you cook? A little. Does your mother still worry about you? Occasionally. Do you call her often enough? Rosaleen groaned. I'm begging you to stop. Nicholas smiled into his glass. I don't mind. No? No. I've never been interviewed over mashed potatoes before. Eleanor looked pleased. There's a first time for everything. Throughout the evening, Nicholas quietly noticed things about Rosaleen, the way she automatically refilled Eleanor's water without being asked, how she subtly checked whether her grandmother had remembered to take her medication, how she made jokes whenever conversations drifted too close to herself. She laughed easily, but every time someone asked about her own future, or relationships, or dreams, she built an invisible wall, changing the subject before anyone reached the truth. She wasn't unfriendly. She was protective. After dinner, Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen to wrap leftover pie for Nicholas. Rosaleen rolled her eyes. She likes you. I gathered. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. I think she's lonely sometimes. So am I. The words escaped before Nicholas could stop them. For a brief second. Neither of them spoke. Then Rosaleen quietly smiled. I understand. As Nicholas waited by the hallway, his eyes drifted toward an old framed family photograph hanging near the staircase. A young Rosaleen, maybe 8 years old, standing between her grandmother and a smiling man with kind eyes. Nicholas's expression changed, only slightly, barely enough for anyone else to notice, but he recognized that face immediately. David Morgan. He looked away before Rosaleen returned, never mentioning it. Outside, after Nicholas had gone home, Eleanor watched her granddaughter clear the dinner table, then smiled knowingly. He likes you. Rosaleen snorted. He repaired 6 feet of cedar. That isn't a proposal. Eleanor calmly folded a dish towel. At my age, competent men with tools are practically romantic heroes. Rosaleen burst into laughter. You have unbelievably low standards. No, I have realistic expectations. Across the fence, in the quiet house next door, Nicholas stood alone by his dining table. The room was dark except for one small lamp. He slowly opened an old yellowed envelope. Across the front, one name was written in faded blue ink. David Morgan, Rosaleen's father. Nicholas rested one hand on the envelope, his expression filled with memories rather than answers. He hadn't come to Quebec expecting his first morning to begin with a broken fence. But now, as he looked toward the neighboring house through the window, one question refused to leave him. Had he just accidentally stepped into someone else's future, or had the past quietly led him here all along? By Monday morning, the fence was finished. Fresh cedar boards stood neatly where rotten wood had once leaned dangerously toward the sidewalk. The paint had dried. The tools were gone. Logically, Nicholas Hamilton had absolutely no reason to appear in Rosaleen Morgan's backyard ever again, yet somehow, he kept showing up. 3 days later, Eleanor decided one of her enormous flower pots needed to be moved from the back patio to the front porch. Rosaleen stood beside it with both hands on the ceramic rim. "It weighs more than my car." Eleanor looked toward the neighboring yard. "Nicholas," Rosaleen immediately protested. "Grandma, we are not borrowing the neighbor every time something is heavy." Nicholas looked over the fence. "What happened?" Rosaleen pointed accusingly at her grandmother. "She happened." Eleanor smiled sweetly. "I only need a little help." 5 minutes later, the flower pot had somehow reached the front porch, without either woman lifting more than a finger. Nicholas wiped the dirt from his gloves. "There," Rosaleen sighed. "I was going to do that. When? I had a schedule." "What day?" "Eventually." He smiled. "I figured." 2 evenings later, the porch light stopped working. Rosaleen climbed onto a chair, balanced awkwardly, dropped the screwdriver, then nearly dropped herself. A voice drifted from next door. "I wouldn't recommend that approach." She looked down. Nicholas stood below holding another ladder. "You own a ladder too?" "I own several." "That's suspicious. It comes with being prepared." Within 10 minutes, the new light bulb was glowing again. Rosaleen folded her arms. "I still could have done it." "I know. You don't sound convinced. I'm trying very hard." The following Saturday, Rosaleen somehow managed to jam the garage door halfway open. She pressed every button she could find. Nothing happened. She kicked the tire of her car instead. The garage door remained unimpressed. Nicholas appeared carrying a toolbox. "Garage?" She looked at him. "Do you actually live next door?" He nodded. "Technically. Because you spend a suspicious amount of time repairing my house." He looked thoughtfully toward her garage. "Your house has a cry for help." She laughed despite herself. "My house has trust issues. So does the owner." She pretended not to hear that last sentence, mostly because it sounded dangerously accurate. The fence had been repaired for nearly 2 weeks. By then, Nicholas had become strangely ordinary, not because he visited constantly, but because every time something went wrong, he somehow happened to be nearby. Rosaleen never invited him. He never invited himself. Life simply kept placing them in the same place, again and again. One afternoon, Rosaleen knocked on Nicholas's front door carrying a pie. He opened it, surprised. "For me?" She shrugged casually. "You repaired my fence. I figured you deserved dessert." He accepted the box. "Thank you. I made it." "You baked?" She nodded confidently. "Entirely. I appreciate the effort." For the next several days, nothing more was said. Until exactly 1 week later, Nicholas appeared outside while Rosaleen was watering flowers. "I've been meaning to ask." She looked up. "About what?" He smiled very seriously. "Your baking." She looked suspicious. "What about it?" "It has the exact same address as the bakery downtown." She blinked. "What?" He reached into his kitchen recycling bin and produced the folded pie box. The small bakery sticker remained attached underneath. She covered her face. "I forgot the sticker. I noticed." "You waited an entire week?" "I was giving you an opportunity to confess." She sighed dramatically. "It was a family recipe." He nodded. "Whose family?" She answered without missing a beat. "The Tremblays." "Who own the bakery?" Nicholas laughed. "A remarkably talented family. They work very hard. I can tell." She pointed a finger at him. "You are never letting this go." "Probably not." If Rosaleen slowly began enjoying Nicholas's company, Eleanor had absolutely no intention of pretending otherwise. She adored him, not because he was handsome, or successful, or polite, though he certainly was all three. She liked him because he treated older people as though their stories still mattered. When Rosaleen became stuck at school one afternoon, Nicholas quietly drove Eleanor to pick up her prescription. When Eleanor's old radio stopped working, he spent an hour repairing it instead of replacing it. When she told the same story about accidentally baking salt instead of sugar into a birthday cake, for the 3rd time that month, he laughed at exactly the same places, never once saying, "You've told me this already." After Nicholas left that evening, Rosaleen watched her grandmother smiling at the repaired radio. "You really like him?" Eleanor looked up. I like how he listens. That's different. Rosaleen nodded quietly. It really was. A few nights later, the air carried the first real chill of autumn. Rosaleen and Nicholas sat on the front steps after finishing another unnecessarily complicated discussion about whether squirrels secretly planned neighborhood chaos. Silence settled comfortably between them. Rosaleen broke it first. I've dated before. Nicholas looked toward her. But they never really became anything. You didn't want them to. She thought for a long moment. I wanted the idea. She stared across the quiet street. I got used to not needing anyone. My dad passed away years ago. My mom lives in Ottawa now. We talk. But it isn't the same. She smiled sadly. My grandmother is the most stable family I've got left. Nicholas listened without interrupting. Finally he asked gently, and when your grandmother doesn't need you anymore? Rosaleen answered immediately, she'll always need me. Before Nicholas could reply, a voice floated through the open kitchen window. I can hear you. Both of them looked toward the house. Beat. Then Eleanor added loudly, and that's wildly optimistic. Rosaleen buried her face in her hands. She's impossible. Nicholas smiled. I've noticed. The next evening, rain arrived without warning, heavy and cold. The newly painted section of fence still needed another day to dry properly. Rosaleen rushed outside carrying a tarp. The wind immediately stole one corner. Oh, seriously? Another pair of hands grabbed the opposite side. Nicholas. I figured the fence might need saving. Together they struggled against the wind, laughing every time the tarp behaved like a sail instead of a cover. By the time they secured it, both of them were soaked. Garage? Nicholas suggested. She nodded. They hurried inside the small shed beside the house. Rain hammered loudly against the roof. Their breathing slowly settled. Water dripped from Nicholas' hair. Rosaleen laughed. You look terrible. So do you. I know. It suits you. She smiled. For the first time, neither of them looked away immediately. The laughter faded. The distance between them quietly disappeared. A single maple leaf had tangled itself in Rosaleen's damp hair. Nicholas reached up carefully. His fingers brushed against her temple as he removed it. She looked into his eyes. He stepped just a little closer, close enough to hear her breathing. Close enough that neither of them could pretend they hadn't imagined this moment before. Then, her phone rang. Rosaleen jumped. Eleanor, she answered instantly. Grandma, are you okay? A cheerful voice replied. You're out of milk. Rosaleen blinked. Are you dying? A thoughtful pause. Eventually, the line went silent. Rosaleen slowly lowered the phone. Nicholas looked at her. She looked back. Then both of them burst into laughter. The moment was gone, destroyed by an elderly woman and an empty refrigerator. Yet, neither of them could pretend anymore. Whatever this had become. It was no longer just neighborly kindness. Later that night, Nicholas returned home. He quietly opened the old envelope resting inside his desk drawer. This time, he removed the photograph hidden inside. Two young men stood beside a fishing dock. One was David Morgan, Rosaleen's father. The other, Robert Hamilton, Nicholas' father. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were just a few words. To Robert, I still owe you more than I can repay. Nicholas traced the handwriting with his thumb, then slowly looked toward the illuminated window of the Morgan house next door. Had moving beside Rosaleen really been an accident, or had he known exactly whose fence he intended to fix before he ever picked up the hammer? For the first time since Nicholas had arrived next door, life felt almost normal. The fence had become an excuse for conversations. Conversations had quietly become dinners. Dinners had somehow turned into looking for reasons to knock on each other's doors. Neither of them admitted it. Neither of them had to. Late Wednesday afternoon, Rosaleen stood outside Nicholas's front porch holding 2 grocery bags. He opened the door. You forgot something? She shook her head. No, I was wondering. If you'd like to have dinner. He smiled. I thought your grandmother usually handled invitations. This one's from me. Before he could answer, Eleanor's voice floated through the open kitchen window next door. Should I leave? Rosaleen closed her eyes. Yes. Wonderful. I've waited 29 years for this. Rosaleen groaned. I've only been dating since I was 16. Exactly. 13 disappointing years. Nicholas laughed so hard he nearly dropped the grocery bag. Rosaleen pointed toward her grandmother's house. Ignore her. I don't think that's possible. It isn't. An hour later, Rosaleen knocked on Nicholas's front door carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. The smell of garlic and rosemary drifted through the house. She stepped inside. The dining table had been carefully set. Candles, fresh bread, homemade pasta, a salad that looked suspiciously perfect. She looked around. You did all this? I tried. You cook? I survive. She smiled. We'll see. Halfway through dinner, she noticed something she hadn't expected. Nicholas kept checking the oven clock, straightening napkins that didn't need straightening, apologizing every time the sauce simmered a little too loudly. She finally laughed. What? You seem nervous. He looked genuinely surprised. I do? You've adjusted those forks 3 times. I have. And you've apologized to the bread. He stared at the basket. I might have. She smiled warmly. I thought architects were confident. We are, usually. So what happened tonight? He looked directly at her. You came over. Her smile softened. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply didn't need words. After dinner they stepped onto the back deck. The autumn air carried the scent of cedar from the newly repaired fence. The neighborhood had grown quiet. Rosaleen leaned against the railing. I like it here. So do I. I'm glad you moved next door. Nicholas looked toward her. I'm glad too. She turned. Their eyes met. This time, neither of them looked away. He stepped closer, carefully, as though giving her every opportunity to change her mind. She didn't. Their first kiss was gentle, short, a little awkward, mostly because both of them smiled halfway through it. When they finally separated, Nicholas rubbed the back of his neck. So, was that terrible? Rosaleen pretended to think. I've had worse. He winced dramatically. That's devastating. She continued with perfect seriousness. I've also had better. He looked completely defeated. Really? A beat. Then she smiled. That was a lie. He laughed in relief. I almost believed you. I know. I enjoyed watching you panic. I noticed. He reached for her hand. This time, she let him keep it. For one beautiful evening, the future seemed surprisingly simple. Later that night, Rosaleen volunteered to help clear the dishes. Nicholas disappeared into the pantry looking for dessert plates. I'll be right back. She wandered toward the kitchen counter. A folder rested beside an unopened stack of mail, completely ordinary, until one name caught her eye. David Morgan, her father. Everything inside her stopped. She stared at the envelope, then heard Nicholas returning. He froze the instant he saw where she was looking. Neither of them spoke. His silence was somehow more frightening than any explanation could have been. Rosaleen slowly picked up the envelope. Her voice became almost a whisper. Why, do you have my father's name? Nicholas closed his eyes. He had imagined this conversation 100 different ways. None of them had begun like this. He slowly walked toward her. My father, Robert Hamilton. He knew David Morgan. Rosaleen frowned. You knew my father? I was young, but yes. My father and yours were friends. She waited. He continued quietly. Years ago, my father became very sick. He lost his job. We were close to losing our house. My parents never talked much about money. I only understood later how desperate things really were. He swallowed. Your father gave mine a job, when nobody else would. He loaned him enough money to keep our home. And when my father finally tried to repay him, David refused to take all of it back. Rosaleen stood perfectly still. Nicholas continued. When my father passed away, I found letters, this envelope, and one promise. He wanted to thank David properly, but he never had the chance. He looked down. So, I started looking. I learned David had passed away too, and eventually, I found you. Rosaleen slowly lowered the envelope. Every memory from the past few weeks replayed differently. The broken fence, the first dinner, the conversations, the laughter, the kiss. So, she whispered, you didn't just happen to help me. Nicholas answered honestly. The fence really was falling. She looked at him in disbelief. That's your defense? No, it's just the truth. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Rosaleen shook her head. You already knew who I was. Yes, you moved next door, already knowing my name. The house was genuinely for sale. I needed a place to live. And yes, I knew you lived beside it." She laughed once, a short, painful laugh. "I don't even know what's real anymore. Everything after that fence was real." She looked away. "I don't know if I believe that." Finally, she asked the question neither of them could escape. Was any of it actually about me? The words hit Nicholas harder than anything else she had said. He didn't answer immediately, because this time, the truth deserved every second. "When I moved here, my plan was simple. I wanted to meet you, give you my father's letters, thank you, and then leave your life exactly the way I found it." He smiled sadly. "Instead, I looked over the fence. I saw you. I realized I had absolutely no idea how to begin a conversation with, 'Hi, our dead fathers knew each other.'" Rosaleen remained silent. Then the fence started falling. "I fixed it. Your grandmother invited me to dinner. You accidentally lied about baking. You laughed at my terrible jokes." He looked directly into her eyes. "Nothing happened the way I planned." He took one slow breath. "I came because of your father." A pause. His voice became softer. "I stayed because of you." Tears filled Rosaleen's eyes. She wanted to believe him. She truly did. But one thought refused to disappear. "You should have told me, before you kissed me." The words landed heavily between them. Nicholas didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't argue. He simply nodded. "You're right." That somehow hurt even more. Rosaleen quietly set the envelope back onto the counter, then walked toward the front door. He didn't stop her, because he knew he had already waited too long. An hour later, Rosaleen sat silently at the kitchen table while Eleanor made tea. She finally told her everything. The letters, Robert Hamilton, the fence, the kiss, the secret. When she finished, she expected her grandmother to immediately agree that Nicholas had betrayed her trust. Instead, Eleanor quietly reached for the old envelope. She studied David Morgan's handwriting for a very long time, long enough that Rosaleen became confused. Finally, Eleanor looked up. Her voice was calm, almost distant. "There's something about your father that you don't know either." The room fell silent. Rosaleen stared at her grandmother. For the first time that night, she realized the past might be hiding more than one secret. The hospital waiting room had always frightened Rosaleen, not because of the machines, or the quiet voices, or even the smell of antiseptic that seemed to erase every trace of ordinary life. It frightened her because hospitals reminded her of endings, the place where she'd last held her father's hand, the place where every promise had suddenly become too late. Now, she sat across from her grandmother at the kitchen table, staring at the old envelope with David Morgan's handwriting. Outside, autumn rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, neither woman spoke for a long time. Finally, Rosaleen whispered, "What don't I know?" Eleanor gently traced David's name with one finger, then looked toward the family photograph hanging in the hallway. "You've spent years remembering your father exactly the way he looked in that picture." She smiled sadly. "Kind, strong, certain." Rosaleen nodded. "Because that's who he was." "Yes," Eleanor replied softly, "but not every day." She folded her hands together. "There was a time, after your mother lost her job, and your father couldn't find enough construction work. Everything became very heavy." Rosaleen frowned. "Dad never told me. You were little. He wanted to protect you." Eleanor looked out the window. There were weeks when he barely slept. He worried about paying the mortgage, about feeding his family, about disappointing everyone. Her voice became quieter. One night, he packed a suitcase. Rosaleen stared at her. What? He truly believed everyone would be better off without him. Silence filled the room. I found him sitting in his truck. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was exhausted. Rosaleen felt tears forming before she even realized it. "My father wanted to leave?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "For a little while. He believed running away would hurt less than failing." Rosaleen shook her head. "I don't understand. What stopped him?" Eleanor smiled gently. "Robert Hamilton, Nicholas' father. He found David sitting outside a hardware store the next morning. They talked for hours. I never learned every word, but I know Robert convinced him to come home. He helped David find temporary work, introduced him to people, reminded him that asking for help wasn't weakness. Rosaleen looked down at the envelope. So, Robert helped Dad. Yes, Eleanor smiled. And years later, when Robert became sick, when his own family needed someone, David quietly helped him. Rosaleen slowly looked up. There wasn't one hero. There never is. They simply took turns carrying each other. The kitchen became very quiet. Everything Nicholas had told her suddenly sounded different. There was never a debt, Rosaleen whispered. Eleanor shook her head. No. There was friendship. Two stubborn men, both too proud. Both are too generous, neither one keeping score. She looked directly at her granddaughter. Your fathers weren't keeping score, so why are you? The question landed harder than Rosaleen expected, because she had no answer. She wiped away a tear. You knew all this. For years. Yes, you never told me. No. Rosaleen folded her arms. And you're lecturing Nicholas about honesty? Eleanor nodded without the slightest embarrassment. Yes. Rosaleen blinked. Seriously? I'm old, Eleanor replied with complete dignity. Hypocrisy is one of the few luxuries I have left. Rosaleen stared at her, then laughed despite herself. I cannot believe you. I've had decades of practice. The laughter faded. Rosaleen stood. I need to find Nicholas. Eleanor smiled softly. I think that would be wise. Rosaleen reached for her coat, then heard something unusual. A small sound behind her. She turned. Eleanor had pressed one hand against her chest. Her breathing suddenly became shallow. Grandma? Eleanor tried to answer. Couldn't. The teacup slipped from her fingers. It shattered across the kitchen floor. Rosaleen reached her before she hit the ground. Grandma. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Everything happened too quickly. Paramedics, questions, blood pressure, oxygen, hospital lights. By the time Rosaleen finally sat down in the emergency waiting room, her hands were still shaking. Doctors believed it wasn't a heart attack. But Eleanor would need several hours of observation. Rosaleen stared at her phone. Without thinking, she opened Nicholas' contact. Her thumb hovered over the call button. She wanted him there, more than she expected. But then another thought followed immediately. Did she have the right? After everything that had happened? Slowly, she lowered the phone without pressing call. Half an hour later, someone quietly sat beside her. Rosaleen looked up. Nicholas. She blinked. I didn't call. I know. He spoke gently. Your grandmother called me this afternoon. Rosaleen frowned. Why? She wanted me to look at the loose railing on the back porch tomorrow. He smiled faintly. When she stopped answering, I got worried. I went over. The ambulance was already leaving. Neither of them spoke again. There wasn't anything useful to say. Instead, they simply sat together, shoulder to shoulder, watching nurses walk through quiet hallways. Sometimes, love doesn't announce itself with speeches. Sometimes, it simply refuses to let someone wait alone. Nearly 2 hours later, the doctor finally smiled. She's awake. You can both go in. Rosaleen hurried inside. Eleanor looked tired, but unmistakably herself. She opened one eye, saw both of them standing there, and sighed dramatically. Did you two fix this yet? Rosaleen stared. You were unconscious. Eleanor nodded. And apparently, neither of you used the time productively. Even Nicholas laughed. The tension inside the room finally loosened. Later that evening, as Eleanor rested comfortably, Nicholas walked Rosaleen toward the hospital entrance. Cold air drifted through the automatic doors. He stopped before reaching the parking lot. I've made a decision. She looked at him. I need to leave Quebec for a little while. My firm's asked me to oversee a restoration project. It'll only be a few weeks. Rosaleen felt her stomach tighten. Because of this? He nodded honestly. Partly. Then added quietly. You deserve the chance to decide whether you want me here. Without me standing next door every morning, making the decision harder. She looked at him. He wasn't sacrificing himself. He wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. He was simply giving her space, something he should have given her from the beginning. I understand, she whispered. He smiled sadly. I hope one day you'll understand me too. He gently squeezed her hand once, then let go. No dramatic goodbye, no promises, just honesty. Finally, after Nicholas left, Rosaleen returned to Eleanor's room. Her grandmother was awake again, pretending to watch late-night television. She didn't even glance away from the screen. "Do you want him gone?" Rosaleen sat quietly beside the bed. "I don't know." Eleanor smiled without looking at her. "You're 29. Surely by now, you've learned that's usually what people say, when the answer frightens them." Rosaleen didn't reply, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid that Nicholas had entered her life for the wrong reason. She was afraid he might leave before she figured out whether she loved the man he truly was, or only the story of how they had met. Outside the hospital window, the rain had finally stopped, and somewhere beyond the city lights, a house with a newly repaired fence stood quietly waiting. By the time Eleanor was discharged from the hospital, the maple trees had surrendered nearly all their leaves. Autumn no longer felt gentle, it felt honest. The kind of season that quietly reminded people nothing stayed exactly the same forever. Rosaleen drove her grandmother home, helped her settle into her favorite chair, made tea, listened to strict instructions about not hovering. "I had one episode," Eleanor said. "I didn't become porcelain." Rosaleen smiled. "I know. You'll still hover. I know." That evening, unable to settle her thoughts, Rosaleen stepped into the backyard. The repaired fence stretched quietly beneath the fading light, the same fence that had begun everything. She slowly ran her fingers across the smooth cedar boards, then stopped. One small section near the corner remained unfinished, only 3 boards. Beside them rested a neatly stacked pile of fresh cedar, a small box of nails, a hammer, and a folded note. Rosaleen opened it. "I figured you could finish this part yourself." A second line waited underneath. "Try to keep the nails straight," she laughed, then immediately cried. Only Nicholas could somehow make her laugh through tears. She picked up the hammer, looked at the unfinished fence, then quietly shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't think I'm supposed to finish this alone." 5 minutes later, she was standing on Nicholas' front porch. The moving boxes were already loaded into the back of his truck. The driver's door stood open. Nicholas turned around when he heard her footsteps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rosaleen looked at the truck. "You're leaving?" He nodded. Temporarily, she folded her arms. "That's inconvenient." A tiny smile appeared. "For whom?" She pretended to think. "I'm still deciding." His smile grew. He had missed that. He had missed her. Rosaleen slowly held out the old envelope. The letters. Nicholas accepted them carefully. "I think they belong to both families." She looked toward the fence between their yards. "We turned our father's friendship into a debt." He quietly nodded. "I know. I kept thinking I had to repay something, and I kept thinking Dad had to be perfect." She smiled sadly. Neither of them would have liked that very much. Nicholas looked at the faded handwriting. "So, if it wasn't a debt, what was it?" Rosaleen took one step closer. It was just someone showing up when somebody needed help. Silence settled softly between them. The same quiet truth echoed through every part of their story. A broken fence, an unexpected dinner, a repaired radio, a shared hospital chair. Nobody had been keeping score. They had simply shown up. Nicholas looked down at the envelope, then back at her. "I don't regret finding you." His voice was steady. "I regret not telling you sooner." He took a slow breath. "I can't change why I came here." He looked directly into her eyes. "But I know why I don't want to leave." Rosaleen stepped closer. "So, why?" A small smile crossed his face. "Because somewhere, between repairing your fence and being interrogated by your grandmother, this started feeling like home." Tears slipped quietly down Rosaleen's cheeks. This time, she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she smiled. A real one. The kind that reached her eyes. She looked at him for several long seconds, then said the simplest words she could find. "Then stay for dinner." Nicholas blinked. "Is your grandmother cooking?" She shook her head. "No. Are you?" "Yes." He pretended to consider the offer very carefully. That's a much bigger commitment than I expected." Rosaleen laughed and gently punched his shoulder. "You deserve that." "I probably do." She stepped even closer. This time, neither of them hesitated. Their kiss wasn't interrupted by telephones, or storms, or misunderstandings. Only autumn leaves drifting quietly across the yard. When they finally pulled apart, Rosaleen rested her forehead against his. "I love you." The words came quietly, without music, without speeches, without fear. Nicholas smiled. "I love you too." It felt wonderfully ordinary, exactly the way the best truths usually do. Some time later, the backyard looked different, not because the fence had fallen again, but because Nicholas was taking part of it apart. Rosaleen stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She leaned against the porch railing. "You know that's my fence, right?" Nicholas looked over his shoulder. A familiar grin appeared. "Technically, it's ours now." She laughed. "That's disturbingly confident for a man who hasn't survived the wedding yet." Before Nicholas could answer, Eleanor's voice floated from the porch swing. "If she doesn't marry you, Nicholas, I will." Rosaleen covered her face. "Grandma," Nicholas smiled proudly. "Finally, someone appreciates craftsmanship." Eleanor nodded. "I have excellent taste." Rosaleen laughed so hard she nearly spilled both coffees. The last section of cedar came away. In its place, Nicholas installed a simple wooden gate. Nothing elaborate, just wide enough for 2 people to walk through together. The fence had once divided 2 neighboring homes. Now, it simply marked where one yard became another. Without keeping anyone apart, Eleanor watched quietly from the porch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. She smiled to herself. Years ago, 2 fathers had quietly carried each other through difficult seasons, neither expecting anything in return, neither imagining that kindness would travel across decades, and return wearing different faces, not as fate, not as repayment, simply as another person choosing to show up. Sometimes we spend so much time wondering why someone came into our lives that we forget to notice what they chose to do after they arrived. Nicholas first walked into Rosaleen's story because of something that happened years before either of them had a choice. But he stayed because every ordinary day gave him a new reason to. A broken fence became a shared project. A family dinner became a new tradition. An old debt became a friendship remembered. And 2 people who were both carrying the weight of the past finally learned that love isn't something we earn by paying back yesterday. It's something we build together today. Perhaps that's the quiet lesson hidden in this story. The people we love most are rarely the ones who appear at the perfect moment. They're the ones who keep showing up, when the fence falls, when life becomes uncertain, when words fail, when all they can really offer is their presence. And sometimes, that's the greatest gift anyone can give. If someone quietly walked into your life today, not to change your past, but simply to help you carry tomorrow, would you recognize them before they walked away? If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more uplifting romances. Thank you for spending your time with us. We'll see you in the next story, where another unexpected meeting may become the beginning of a forever worth remembering.